Okay, so I'm John Hodnott. I'm sitting here with Stefan Dercon, Professor of Development Economics at the University of Oxford. Stefan has been involved in the Ethiopia Rural Household Survey for a long, long time, maybe longer than he cares to remember. And I'm just going to ask him some questions about the survey and what he's found. So to begin, Stefan, why was it in 1994 you and your colleagues decided to actually start the survey up, or perhaps restart it given the earlier 89 round?
Well, in 1992, I took on my first job. My first job was actually to be a visiting professor at the University of Addis Ababa. And working with our colleagues there, the first thing that struck us that there were just no data of what's been happening in the countryside. We also knew a lot of things were changing. The country had come out of a war in about 91. There was the beginning of reforms taking place where they were going to move much more to a market-led economy from a very heavily controlled and clearly very distorted economy. So the idea was there early on, let's try to do a longitudinal survey, but we knew that some of the biggest changes were actually happening at that very moment. And if you then want to do a longitudinal survey, you always will have to regret that you don't really have any observations from before the serious period of reform. So we then set out to actually try to identify a survey that was of reasonable or good quality that was done before 91. And we hit upon a survey done by IFPRI in 1989, which was largely looking at the recovery from the famine of 84-85. That was a survey taking place in 6 villages. These villages were largely in the south of the country or the center of the country, simply because in 89, because of the war, people could not have surveyed in the north. And so we then decided to, well, let's at least, first of all, get all these surveys back. It took us a long time. In fact, we ended up spending a lot of time, even in the archives at IFPRI, photocopying the original questionnaires, getting the names identified, and then we set out to try to track these people again. But at the same time, we thought, well, to be really relevant for Ethiopia, and if we're going to be here doing this for a long time, we better expand the sample. We knew for budgetary reasons, for logistical reasons, to do a longitudinal survey in a country that's just recovering with relatively poor infrastructure, we were bound to have to limit ourselves to a relatively small number of clusters. So we decided to, largely for budgetary reasons, to actually say, well, at best we can probably look at maybe about 15 or so villages. And so we then set out to actually say, well, how can you sample these villages? Well, these villages, it's very hard to then do any kind of proper sampling frame, but we kind of broadly stratified on the basis of the information we had the country in terms of broad agroecological zones. And then we simply decided to, broadly proportional to the population figures that we had, which were very weak as well, a country in war doesn't really have a good census, to actually more or less get these balances right in the sample. So the result is a sample that is what we typically refer to as broadly representative for the agroecological zones in the country, and actually once other data start coming in, it does seem to be behaving in general more or less as you would expect relative to the national sample.